at those who don't look like us or have the same surnames or pray the way we do. And at such moments, courage is necessary. At such moments, we need courage to stand up to hate, not just in others, but in ourselves. At such moments, we need the courage to stand up to dogma, not just in others, but in ourselves. At such moments, we need courage to believe that together we can tackle big challenges like inequality and climate change.
However, in today's rapidly growing society, hate is barely paid any attention. The numerous masses of citizens around the world instead ignore the fact that hate surrounds everyone and move through life ignoring the obvious. People worldwide are heavily influenced by unneeded and unjust acts of hatred every day. All across the globe, and especially in America, the people of our country become entrapped by self-ideals that block out our morally sound choices. Hate is found in all shapes and sizes and is plentiful in everyone. Whether you know it or not, all people have an innate ability to stereotype, judge, and create prejudices that in time turn into false representations of people. We spend most of our lives surrounded by people that look and act just like us. We create rigid formulas on who is to be labeled good and who is bad. This system of ranks essentially guarantees that we will continue to see difference without making any effort to understand it. These inborn characteristics about humans lead us all to be a little biased in our own views. By doing this, we are disregarding the beauty in our cultural differences and in the world around us as a whole. By understanding how we as humans work, we can all come together and help to be more open about our differences and bring our unconscious biases to rest. In heavily populated areas, hate can become abundant as people become more self-centered. Instead of using diverse streets as an opportunity to become more integrated, people look for ways to create divisions in society and amongst each other. These kinds of people are becoming more and more numerous, and as we grow as a society with people like this, these attitudes have become the foundation of our everyday interactions. Where else would such a behavior be so common than in the South, a center not only known for its growing economy and population, but also for its urban sprawl and historical notion towards hate. Atlanta has a history of de facto segregation, meaning that segregation happens by fact rather than legally. Historically, we have seen this in schools and neighborhoods throughout the southern portion of the United States. In the 1960s, the idea of blacks and whites living cohesively could not be accepted by much of the South. It was the fear of the other that pushed each group away from each other and into isolation. The thought of living amongst the other was unsettling for most, so they moved. This created a divide between people as they naturally separated themselves from each other. We can even still see these divides today throughout Atlanta. The heart of Atlanta was once divided by a fine line. The city became divided with whites in the north and African Americans in the south, using Road Ponce de Leon serving as the divider. The roads north of Ponce were given different names than the roads to the south.
So in the 1960s, Mayor William Hartsfield, once declared Atlanta the city too busy to hate. And while it's true that Atlanta experienced less racial violence than other places throughout the Southeast, specifically when you compare it to a place like Birmingham, Alabama, to say that there wasn't racial animosity in Atlanta would be inaccurate. Probably one of the best examples of this is Ponce de Leon. So Ponce de Leon served as a dividing line between white Atlanta and black Atlanta. And one of the best examples of this is how roads would change names for seemingly no reason as they crossed over ponds. Your two best examples of this are Briarcliff, which runs north-south in the northern part of the city, but when it crosses over ponds, all of a sudden it changes names to Moreland. Another example of this is Monroe, same type of thing. Monroe runs north-south, and as it crosses over ponds, it changes names to Boulevard. And there's really no reason for this because the road's not changing at all, but the reason the road names were changed was because white Atlantans did not want to live on the same road name as black Atlantans. So they requested essentially that the city change the name of these roads so that their addresses would not be the same.
People of one country, one city, and one neighborhood could not learn to coexist. They could not stand to be associated with each other. This is just one of many examples that show how we as humans prefer, consciously and unconsciously, to be with people that we share many similarities with. This mindset leads to the formation of self-segregated zones that still stand today. This separation and isolation is ignored, and many don't even notice it. Not only do we not notice these changes, but we also fear them. Fear is one of our most powerful emotions and propels us to do things that would be considered malicious, but most of the time it helps to keep us safe. Fear can sometimes create a bubble around our heads, a bubble used to steer us in the right direction as it is an evolutionary achievement. However, this bubble can also create unwanted thoughts or actions that provoke ideas such as racism.
I think fear is the bottom line of hate. I think that's what kind of starts to cause that. I wish I had the answers to why, because then we could stop it. But I do think that there's some innate reason that people tend to be afraid of those. Some people tend to be afraid of those who are different.
When exploring the big picture, people hardly stop themselves to ask the simple questions. As a nation, we do not ask ourselves why everyone around us looks just like us, or why we never became friends with that other group of people. We turn our head at the first notion that we might have a bias. However, everyone has a bias, even if it is unconscious. As humans, we form beliefs about specific groups of people and apply them unconsciously. This is called the unconscious bias.
So when we're talking about unconscious bias, we're talking about a couple of different phenomena that are within humans. Psychologists believe that these are here from an evolutionary standpoint because they've helped us with survival. For example, having prejudice or having bias can actually be safe in some situations. If I'm in an unfamiliar situation and I don't know how to respond to that situation, bias or prejudice can actually help me stay safe by avoiding possible dangerous situations. The problem becomes when we start applying these unconscious biases and these prejudices against humans and the groups that humans put themselves in. Because another natural tendency of humans is to put ourselves into groups. We put ourselves into racial groups, ethnic groups, national groups, socioeconomic groups, religious groups. And we have a tendency to have a preference for our own group over others. You can see this all the time. You can see this in the high school cafeteria. You can see this in neighborhoods where people choose to live. When this becomes a problem is because we don't tend to interact with the other people who are quote unquote different from us. And when that happens, we don't gain an understanding of those people who are, again, quote unquote, not like us. And it begins to slowly drive us apart from each other because we're not putting that effort into actually spending time with people who are different than us. So that's one way in which the unconscious bias can actually lead to segregation, can lead to hate between two different groups.
This bias is found in all of us, whether we are aware of it or not. It is evident that we choose our friends based on who looks and acts exactly like us. From the minute we see or hear about a new person, we are subconsciously applying stereotypes. It happens to everyone, all the time, no matter where you are. It happens in the halls of our very own school. As we see and meet new people, we are constantly labeling them as other. We put them into groups based on their superficialities.
I think when someone is other, it's easy to see them in terms of all their superficialities. You can see that, a young woman wears a headscarf, or a young man is dressed in a hoodie, or anything, or a girl looks like she's a preppy cheerleader. And none of those things are what define us as human beings. And so as soon as you are in a position to really sit down and establish common ground with one another, it's easy to see where any of us may have fallen prey to stereotypes, and where instead we are not looking at the right things for ourselves. The more we can see where we are the same, the easier it is to recognize where we've been misinformed about how we're different.
However, the idea that this disconnect between the other and ourselves happens in our very own community is typically ignored. People pay no attention to the conversation when racism and prejudice comes up. It is an uncomfortable topic for most, but an ever so important one for all. As human beings, we all have this unconscious bias that creates stereotypes, whether we know it or not. As humans, we make associations for every word we hear, person we meet, or sight we see. Because of the innate bias we all have, we make associations against specific groups of people. These associations oftentimes are unjustified and lead to negative attitudes and thoughts towards a specific group of people. One key characteristic of the unconscious bias is that it is in fact an unconscious thought. Many well-intentioned white Americans claim to not see color, but subconsciously favor one group over another. Not only is it unrealistic to claim to not see color, it is also taking away from the struggle and experience of the minority you are referring to. To a minority, the phrase means "you don't see me." In today's society, people are so focused on blatantly ignoring skin color in an effort to be post-racial that they tend to ignore the experiences of a minority. This experience is not just blatant discrimination and prejudicial attitudes, it can also be the seemingly small microaggressions felt every day by those of minorities. These microaggressions include every act of verbal and nonverbal insults or slights that communicate hostile and derogatory or negative attitudes towards one another. Many times these microaggressions are unintentional, but this has little effect on how they are interpreted internally by who they are aimed at. Microaggressions, racism, prejudice, and discrimination all evolve from a form of bias within oneself. This bias is what keeps people apart. By bringing this bias into light, we are able to see the differences within each other and acknowledge the struggles we have all been through. Intentional or not, these biases control our thinking and how we go about making relationships and who we consider similar or not. As much as our individual bias contributes to the growth of hate, fear does as well.
I think hate stems from fear. I think it stems from fear of the other, people who don't look like us, act like us, aren't familiar. I really don't understand why that's the case and what purpose that serves. I think it's definitely unconscious bias driven and fear based.
As a human race, we fear the unknown. This fear seems to be hardwired into the American psyche. If someone looks different than you or has different beliefs, it is common practice to be afraid of them. It is this mentality, as well as the tendency to be ignorant towards our unconscious bias, that has led our nation to widespread hate. In 2009, President Obama signed the Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Bill into law. This was a law that made it a federal crime to harm someone based on their sexuality or gender identity. It was an extension to the original hate crime bill that included race and religion. Obama recognized the growing hate in America and had a vision of a cohesive country.
We sense where such cruelty begins, the moment we fail to see in another our common humanity. The very moment when we fail to recognize in a person the same fears and hopes, the same passions and imperfections, the same dreams that we all share. We have for centuries strived to live up to our founding ideal of a nation where all are free and equal and able to pursue their own version of happiness. Through conflict and tumult, through the morass of hatred and prejudice, through periods of division and discord, we have endured and grown stronger and fairer and freer. And at every turn, we've made progress not only by changing laws, but by changing hearts, by our willingness to walk in another's shoes, by our capacity to love and accept even in the face of rage and bigotry.
Nevertheless, making all hate crimes federal offenses has had seemingly little effect on their demise. In 2017, the number of hate crimes rose 10%. It is now the highest it has been in a decade, soaring to over 7,000 reported hate crimes. Many Americans attribute this rise in hate to the election of President Donald Trump. As more influential people publicly express their biases towards certain groups, more people begin to think it is okay to apply these biases in their everyday actions. After these biases have helped you develop your idea of who is genuine and who is not, you begin to see and associate yourself with those who you share similarities with. This, although natural, creates a divide evident everywhere in today's society. This surrounding of ourselves by mirror images has created a social norm in which we were always around people who believe in the same ideals and come from similar backgrounds. All these analogous characteristics, along with isolation, makes it quite easy for judgment of other people's looks and actions to slip into conversations. Groups with little diversity form, and as a result of this, they begin to isolate themselves. These people then begin to form ideals that are direct reflections of each other and drift further and further away from others. These groups take a step back and judge each other from afar and create unfair and uncalled for stereotypes about them. These groups, as they become more and more isolated, become more and more extreme in the way in which they display the hate they have conjured. As these groups hate more, the hate only expands till it is at a point of no return. According to the pyramid of prejudice, all hate starts with simply prejudiced attitudes. This evolves into behaviors, to discrimination, then violence, and finally genocide. Something so small such as a biased attitude can turn into something so hateful and large, as we have seen historically.
Because the more you engage in it, the more you normalize it, and once it's normalized, it becomes part of just the way you think, and you no longer catch yourself and say, oh, I shouldn't say that or I shouldn't think that. But especially if you have an echo chamber of other people around you who share those feelings and they start to feel normal, the ability to turn another human being into other becomes really easily. And once you have us versus them, you sort of dehumanize them, and it becomes exceptionally easy to tip over from biases into hatred, into something that you think is just sort of rebalancing the world, but ultimately winds up becoming a real hate crime.
This is exactly how hate crimes have come to be today. As people with similar beliefs begin to separate themselves with thoughts of being above all other humans, they can expand on their beliefs until they become extremists. They believe that the correct way to handle this situation is to take action and commit violence. This is more noticeable now than ever, as we see stories of this normally on the news. Shootings and other acts of violence like this are very prevalent in a modern world that is becoming more and more self-centered. People everywhere feel isolated and become hate-filled, in turn leading to the normalization of hate. An example of this is the white flight urban America experienced in the 1950s and 60s. This created zones of poverty and holes of debt all around these places inhabited by minorities. We now have factual statistics that areas with minorities do not produce the same quality of work and have higher crime and murder rates. We unconsciously encode these stereotypes and turn them into biased thoughts. It is much easier to associate blacks with words such as awful, hate, and bad. These biases we form without knowing lead into an inability to create relationships with these kinds of people. We separate ourselves and view each other as two distinct peoples, when really we should see each other as one. Hate in America is a very common concept, as we see it in the news and in our personal lives daily. Hate sprouts from all centers of our life, coming from our school, home, or even our extracurriculars. We as humans either ignore such hate or bring it into our own lives. Most of the time we can see how this hate we experience in our own lives plays a role in how we act. People who are exposed to hate can find it humorous or exciting to spread it, and even more. This spreading makes it a social norm and is worse than it should be. Most people are victims to some kind of hate or division. We need to learn how to expose it in order to climb this barrier. America is a country plagued by hate. In 2017, there were 7,175 recorded hate crimes. Over 7,000 times, a person allowed the hate within them to take over and intentionally hurt another human being simply because they are different. A problem so vast and so complex, at first it seems impossible to ever begin to fix. However, some Americans have taken it upon themselves to make our country a little more of a loving place. The immensity of the issue of hate is daunting, so many activists start small, with the youth. Promoting diversity among students and encouraging them to interact with those who are different is one thing many groups focus on. In Atlanta, a city once defined by its segregation, hate, and blatant racism, many organizations have begun to attempt to eliminate hate from our communities and our lives. Founder Todd Mack and board member Corey Jan have noticed the hate in Atlanta and started Music in Common.
Music in Common is a not-for-profit organization, and what we do is we empower youth against hate through the power of collaborative songwriting and performance. And what we do is we bring together teens and young adults who might ordinarily be in conflict with each other. So we've brought together Sudanese and Bhutanese immigrants along with American-born citizens. We've brought together black and white. We've brought together Jews, Christians, and Muslims. We've brought together Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East. Everywhere that we go, and we have hubs in Atlanta, in the Berkshires, and in California. We are bringing together these people who ordinarily would see each other as different. We facilitate them finding ways to establish common ground, and through that process they write an original song together and create a music video of it, and then often later go on to perform it together. These same songs become part of our archive, and they are often used in another program that we have where we bring together professional musicians to perform these songs and interpret them in a more finished and polished way. Overall, it's just a remarkable program.
There is no one solution to the problem of hate, but there is a clear start: communication. Through programs like Music in Common that facilitate communication between those of different race, religion, and backgrounds, the gap between the other and us is closed. We asked board member Corey Jan what she had observed through Music in Common.
Oh my gosh, happens all the time. Every time we have any kind of a Music in Common program, we have people who you would never even imagine being in the same room together, connecting, becoming friends, and these friendships, they go on, they extend well past the program. And that's part of why what we do is so compelling, because you look at a group of, say, 12 students who participate in one of our programs, you think you're only serving these 12 students, but you're not, because they then bring what they've learned to their friend groups and to their communities and even to their families and to their parents. And so the amplification of the concept is huge.
In order to free ourselves of this hate within, we must be open to communicate with those who don't look or act like us. We must be willing to interact with those of different races, backgrounds, and religions. The only way this hate and separation will ever cease is if conversations are started. The more we talk and interact, the more our differences will seem to melt away, and the us versus them mentality with it. Along with communication comes exposure to different cultures and people. The more one has emerged in the practices of those who are different, the more respect is formed. The easier it is to see that they aren't an other, and the harder it is to generalize them into false stereotypes. However, the truth is that we all fall victim to this bias. Being self-aware of this bias and these thoughts is the starting point for eliminating the hate from within ourselves and then in our society. If we can accept that we have a bias, then it is easier to recognize when you let your bias control your actions and behaviors. So often, without meaning to, we as humans allow our unconscious bias to influence our behavior. We say we do not prefer one race or group of people over another, yet we surround ourselves with people of one race and one type of person. If we can learn to make our thoughts, behaviors, and actions in sync, we may be one step closer to a world with a little less hate. When looking at potential solutions to the issue of hate, many look towards making laws to make hate crimes illegal, restrict gun purchase, or to ensure the equality of all people. However, making laws is only half the battle against hate. The other half must be fought within each person. By asking ourselves the seemingly simple question, yet so strongly ignored questions such as, why do I have friends of all one race, religion, or background? We are able to see there is no credible or just answer. Through self-evaluation of our own biases and stereotypes, hate can be stopped. In order to save our country from the cycle of hate we are stuck in, we must look at the hate within.